Okay, well, let's go ahead and get started. I want to thank all of our attendees for joining us today. My name's Tom Giovanetti. I'm the president of the Institute for Policy Innovation, and we're a free market think tank based in Dallas that pay a lot of attention to innovation and technology issues. And we're really delighted that you could join us today for this event recognizing Global Encryption Day. Of course, uh, one of the more famous days on the calendar. Um, but I was thinking in preparation for this event, what sort of like this is like an ultimate nerd policy event. But on the other hand, sometimes I think that's the role that we think tankers can play for our friends is we will nerd out for you. We will be your nerds, and then we'll tell you what you need to understand, and we'll tell you what you need to know about a particular topic issue. And I think today's is a perfectly good example of that. So what we want to do, for those who want to learn more about encryption, we want to sort of cover it from the past history up through the current challenges. And I should say that Global Encryption Day is being recognized all around the world. There are scores of events going on all around the world on just about every continent, and we're delighted to be a part of that. I want to thank you all for attending. I want to thank our panelists for joining us. We have a fabulous panel. And I want to thank those in our audience who are supporters of IPI. We very much appreciate your support. Your support makes things like this possible, and so we very much appreciate it. If after this event you would like to know more about IPI, then I'm going to suggest that you contact Addie Crimmins at IPI. You can get her website, you can get her email address off of our website, or you can chat with her right now live during the event. Addie would be delighted to tell you more about IPI and how you can get involved, as would I. I am not moderating today. Longtime associate of IPI Bartlett Clellan will be moderating and doing short introductions of all of our panelists. I do just want to make a couple quick comments about encryption, and then I may pop in at the end. Um, One of the reasons that IPI cares about a topic like this, encryption, is that we take privacy seriously. We take digital privacy seriously. We take Fourth Amendment protection seriously. And this falls very much, if you are a libertarian leaning, free market leaning organization, individual liberty is one of our key principles. And so if we are to enjoy the benefits of the Constitution, to be secure in our papers, that means you need to be secure in your Android phone too, and you need to be secure on your iPhone, and you need to be secure at your desktop browser when you're making purchases from Amazon, and you need to be secure in your messaging when you are having private messages with friends or business associates. And so encryption makes all of that possible. And so that's why if you're in the audience and you're sort of wondering, why is IPI even talking about that? That's why. And in a digital information society, encryption is crucial to our personal privacy protection. So that's why we care about it. That's why we've gone to the trouble of putting this panel together. Obviously, the folks on the panel care about it as well. That's why they're joining us. So we appreciate that. We appreciate you joining us. And with that, I will turn it over to Bartlett Clellan.
Thank you, Tom. I appreciate it. And I'm going to be very brief and just say that I've been interested in this topic since all but the day I set foot in Washington, D.C. It was the first policy debate that I was forthrightly involved in. And to kind of give you an idea why these people are assembled, I worked with three of these four panelists all the way back then. And we have knocked around this same issue for a number of years. So with that, I'm going to do super brief introductions. Panelists, if you want to say more about your background, you should just feel free when we come to you for your part of the show. But otherwise, suffice to say that in part, I have spent many years getting to know some of these folks, but the first I will introduce is Shane Tews. She's with Logan Circle Strategies, also a senior fellow at AEI. She and I have had the pleasure, or at least I've had the pleasure to work with her in any number of capacities over the years. I think we met after I left Capitol Hill, but she was one of the first think tank people that I got to know way back in the day. Adam Thierer is the first think tank person I got to know. In fact, he's one of the first people I got to know in Washington, D.C. We've been working as colleagues on various tech issues since I just saw a message from him that reminded me it was 1996, which, Adam, I think you're a liar. It can't possibly be that long ago, but in about a year and a half, you and I should go out for a drink and celebrate our 30th anniversary or something.
Right.
A new friend to join us is, and I hope I get your name pronounced first name right. Is it Betta? Very good. Betta with Meta. Meta has been involved in this space. I didn't do that for alliteration there, but Meta has been involved in the encryption space for a long time, as a lot of tech companies are, and that's exactly why we're excited to have them represented here today. And then finally, again, someone I've known since those days of the crypto wars, Greg Nogium. Greg has been in this space forthrightly for way longer than I have been. He has absolutely forgotten more about this topic than I think I've ever learned. And so excited to get to him. So I'm going to start by, because this is a celebratory day, and because for once we don't have kind of immediate urgency of something passing on Capitol Hill. Chuckles are allowed for that. I'm going to I want to take some time to lay out a little bit of the history of what has gone on in the past couple decades in the computer age around encryption. And again, because of his history and involvement here, and because I've heard him give this spiel before, both to privately in the hallway to me, but then generally speaking, Adam, I want to turn to you. So back in 1995 and 96, certainly when I started on this topic, there were any number of pieces of legislation attempted, different people involved in the debate, certainly in the Senate, but in the House too, which we affectionately refer to these days as the crypto wars, the encryption wars. Can you give us a little bit of background on why were we there? What were we doing? And what was the outcome in the 90s?
Sure, Bartlett, and thanks for inviting me to this conversation today. Because Encryption Day and Encryption in general really is very much worth celebrating. I want to start in sort of reverse order before we get to history, and just like let's talk about what it's meant for us concretely. I think rightly everyone does focus, and I know we will today, and I'll let my colleagues elaborate more on what encryption means for our privacy, our security, for freedom of speech, secure channel of communications, ensure all of these things. And that's been essential. But I think it's completely underappreciated just how important encryption has been for the development of the digital economy and really the success of the United States in particular in being a leader in the digital global ecosystem. There was a report put out by the US Bureau of Economic Analysis just a couple of years ago that very few people paid attention to, but it had hard numbers that revealed that in 2022 alone, the US digital economy accounted for over 4 trillion of gross output, roughly 10% of US GDP, 1.3 billion, or I'm sorry, trillion of compensation to people, and 8.9 million jobs. These are absolutely astonishing numbers, and no one really stopped and said, well, how did that happen? And a lot of it happened because we got policy right as a nation, and we specifically got policy right as it came to encryption. And so this is something that's completely underappreciated because without secure channels of communication, not only does freedom of speech and privacy not have a chance, but commerce doesn't have a chance. So that's really why I think encryption is so incredibly important, sort of the value it's created on both the speech front and the economic front. Now, deep history, where do we start? You know, one of the things that I'm always telling my students and young colleagues is that getting old really sucks. But if you live long enough, you sometimes get to see history repeat itself and old debates come back to the fore. And that's really been the case with encryption as the new war on computation begins about artificial intelligence. I see many interesting parallels between these debates, the early crypto wars and today's battle about AI policy. I'll run just through a few of them here to talk about both the history of where we've been and where I think we're going as a nation. With both the crypto wars and with AI policy, again, I call it sort of like a war on computation. What was really at stake was the freedom to code, the freedom to compute, to innovate, and to speak. And both AI today and encryption back then really came down to math and computation. Were we going to allow it? Were we going to allow for the development of these things? While encryption is about ensuring parties can communicate securely, AI is about expanding intelligence, and both of these things are important and should be protected in some ways. We wouldn't want to restrict them and bottle them up. And in both cases, what's interesting to me is we see very similar control mechanisms proposed back then and proposed today. Will this technology, this general purpose technology, be licensed? Will computational power somehow be limited or capped? Back then, it was about capping bits, the bits, how many bits of encryption, powerful encryption you can have versus flops today for AI systems. Well, we have export controls, which were proposed back then for encryption, and label them munitions of war and treat them as something to be regulated like a dangerous instrument of war. Well, that's being proposed for AI today too, and that's where we were at in the mid-90s for encryption. Would we go even further and have complete control through backdoors and surveillance, almost quasi-nationalization? Back then, we had the so-called Clipper chip proposal for backdooring powerful cryptography systems. And today we have AI systems that people are proposing. We have chip-level surveillance and tracking or quasi-nationalization of labs and controls. And we even have common agencies involved in the fights. Both back then and today, we had Department of Commerce, we had State, we had Department of Defense, Department of Justice, NSA, of course, FBI, and many others. Common players. One other final important way that these debates are very similar is that they brought out a strange bedfellows opposition. Bartley, you mentioned when we met back in the mid-90s, you were on the Hill, I was working at the Heritage Foundation. I brought together an event to bring together all the strange bedfellows that were sort of opposed, including Heritage, to the idea of these restrictions on encryption. And it's the same today. We have very interesting, strange bedfellows worried about, like, what do these new types of regulations for AI mean for the power of digital systems or open source technologies and secure communications, of course, not just on First Amendment grounds, but also privacy and security grounds. So I really think when you look back at the history of this and the fact that, you know, the freedom of code, the freedom of compute, freedom to innovate, we won. This was the single most important policy issue I was involved with in my lifetime. One of the very few times I can say I was actually part of a win. I'm usually on the losing side of everything. But this was huge. This was a big, big moment in the history of digital technology policy in the United States and the world. And it has been so profoundly important. But we might run the risk of sort of repeating the mistakes of the past and going right back down the same path of seeking to control this really incredible, what should be technology of freedom, and converting it instead to sort of a technology of repression. So with that, I'll turn it back to you because I know others will probably fill in a lot more blanks there about the ancient history of where we've come from and where we're going.
Thank you so much, Adam. And I don't think I said, you're with R Street as a resident fellow, if people are looking to find you these days. So let me go to Greg. Greg, I couldn't think of a better person to do the next part. Greg is Senior Counsel and Director of the Security and Surveillance Project at the Center for Democracy and Technology. They were certainly an ally back in the CDT, that is, Center for Democracy and Technology, and Greg, back when we had these discussions in the 90s. It was a politically strange bedfellows coalition, but I think the common thread was folks who were supportive of liberty and self-determination of people, privacy in their personal effects and in their communications. And at a base level, that's what encryption is. It's essentially a lock on your information, digital lock, so to speak. So, Greg, with that, a couple things. Very interestingly, you are part of the group of people who promote this day. So would love to hear some about that, but also would love to hear what's going on right now. I know you've got your finger on the pulse of the issues of today.
First, thank you so much, IPI and Bartlett, for having me here. It's just a real pleasure. I'm on the steering committee of the Global Encryption Coalition, and this is a coalition of about 434 members, mostly NGOs, located around the world in 105 countries, and we've all come together to protect encryption. And yes, we created Global Encryption Day. If I had a party hat, I'd put it on and give you each one because this should be a celebratory day. Um, Bartlett, I was thinking about the historical perspective that we just heard, and I look back at the brief that my organization filed in the Bernstein case. This was a case of a university professor who had made an encryption algorithm and he wanted to export it. And the government said, you can't export it because we have controlled the export of encryption. And he said, this is my speech. I have a First Amendment right to do this. Code is speech. And he wrote out the code in longhand, regular English language. And he said, are you going to stop me from exporting this? And the court eventually agreed with him. It was a 1999 appeals court decision. It was the beginning of the end of Clipper chip and the controls on encryption at that time. Fast forward to today, and what are we looking at? It's a little different, although I'll get back to how it's the same in just a second. But it's a little different in that the attacks on encryption are less direct. They're sneaky. Instead of saying you can't encrypt, or instead of saying you can't export strong encryption, the attack today is you, platform, must moderate content and make it so that it's not available to people because it's objectionable or illegal. Anytime a platform is given a responsibility to control what appears on the platform, it's really hard to do that when you can't read it. And you can't read it if it's end-to-end encrypted. So it's like a backdoor attack, if you will, on encryption through a requirement imposing a duty on a entity. This is coming up in the UK with the legislation that they just passed, the Online Safety Act. It came up in Australia in recent legislation that also passed. And that legislation is being interpreted now. And it's an issue with respect to legislation at the EU level too. So for all the EU states, there's a CSAM proposal that would also impose a duty on providers, very hard to discharge unless you have access to content. What's happening here in the United States? Same thing. Stop CSAM, COSA, Kids Online Safety Act, the Cooper-Davis Act, the Earn It Act, the Take It Down Act. These are all bills that in one way or another impose a duty on providers to deal with objectionable content that, if their platform is encrypted, they can't read, which creates this incentive to either not offer encryption or to risk being sued. And it's a real issue. And Congress knows how to deal with it if they want to deal with it properly. For example, in the Stop CSAM Act, they actually accept out a lot of the services that are encrypted. And that makes sense. The Take It Down Act doesn't accept out messaging services. Now that's kind of strange because there's nothing to take down. It's just a communication between us in a small group or maybe a large group, but there's nothing really to take down. So I'll just leave you with this thought that the attacks on encryption today tend to be a lot sneakier than the direct attacks in the past, with one exception that I wanted to mention before I leave you, which is that there was just an arrest in France of the head of Telegram. He's a French citizen. Telegram offers some services that are encrypted. Most communications on Telegram are not encrypted. And we can get into that if folks want to. But they arrested Pavel Durov, the head of Telegram, for not complying with law enforcement requests for disclosure, not complying with law enforcement demands to take down unlawful content, and also for failure to register an encrypted service and for failure to get permission to export encryption. Well, that sounds familiar, doesn't it? Just happened a couple months ago. Back to you, Bartlett.
Thank you so much. Do you remember back when that case, I think it was before that case came out, you could get the T-shirt that had the entire code printed on it. And it was one of the first websites back then. I mean, there were other websites, but that's all it had. You could just go to that URL and it just had the entire code. And it was Okay, it's out there now. What are you going to do about it? Which I thought was awesome, just as speech should be. All right, with that, so we've had a little bit of the background, the history, how we got here. We've got a lay of the land legislatively, which is interesting, but I suspect most people still kind of puzzled, like, why do they care? Do they use encryption every day? Is it irrelevant to their lives? Are products interested in this, or is this just a bunch of us old nerds getting together to talk about a arcane policy issue? So to address some of those points, we've invited Betta to join us with Facebook, and he is the policy manager for messaging, which sounds awfully darn appropriate for this topic with Meta. And so I will turn it over to you with talk to us a little bit about current use of encryption and why that's important, whether for Meta or more broadly for technology.
Thanks, Bartlett. Good afternoon, and thank you to IPI for convening such a timely and important discussion, and of course to colleagues here and Greg in particular for championing Global Encryption Day and making this such a prominent moment to discuss so many important issues in so many parts of the world. In my day job at Meta, I support Meta's messaging apps, WhatsApp, Messenger, Instagram Direct, and oversee the sort of implementation of end-to-end encryption across these apps. So today, I'd like to talk about both the critical importance of end-to-end encryption for people and how at Meta we're implementing this technology to protect conversations of billions of people across the world. A while back, Bartlett, you mentioned you likened encryption to a lock that protects digital conversations. And while I think that's a clear articulation of the architecture of it, I think encryption is slightly broader than that. At its core, encryption is a promise. It's a promise that only the sender and recipient can learn the contents of a conversation and have access to the keys that can decrypt this conversation. And no party outside of that conversation, not the service provider, not some government, not law enforcement trying to observe the network, can learn the contents or infer the contents of this conversation. But to understand how it's implemented, let's break it down into its constituent elements. Any two people can encrypt their conversations. They can take a key and turn their plain text into what we call ciphertext, a garbled version of that text that cannot be read by anyone else. But there are a couple of problems with this. In order for us to encrypt our communications, we need to pre-decide a key, which means we need to meet beforehand and exchange a key to encrypt our communications, or we need to send each other the key to encrypt our communications. And when we do that, either the key can fall into the wrong hands, or we're not able to meet, and therefore we rely on some sort of insecure version of communication. Encryption, end-to-end encryption, solves this problem through the means of public key cryptography, which means we take a key to encrypt the communication and break it into two parts, a public key and a private key. Anyone can use the public key to encrypt the conversation and communication and send it to me, but only I, with the private key that I have, can decrypt this conversation. This is like, this can be likened to a special mailbox where anyone can drop a letter, but only I can open that mailbox to access what's written in that letter, and no one else can. At Meta, we believe that privacy shouldn't be an affirmative choice that people make every time. Because if they did, then a lot of people might not pick the more private option, either because of a lack of technological sophistication or because of regular ease of use, which means privacy would then be a privilege available to those that have some technological know-how, or people that bother to go ahead and opt for the more private experience. That shouldn't be how things are, which is why on our apps where we support end-to-end encryption, we offer it by default. On WhatsApp, encryption was turned on by default in 2016, which meant billions of users automatically had their conversations upgraded to end-to-end encrypted, which meant that we couldn't access it, no one else could access it. We had been in the process of implementing the same system on Messenger, And last year, after like 5 years of hard work, we upgraded the conversation one-to-one chats on Messenger to end-to-end encrypted. And we're now in the process of upgrading Messenger group chats to encrypted, and soon Instagram Direct will also be upgraded to be more private. But we've also realized that no matter how well we design these systems, we don't operate in an isolation. We offer end-to-end encrypted chats, protect people's conversations passing through our servers, but a lot of people save their message history. They back it up. And when they back it up, they save it on a Google Drive or an iCloud or some other third-party cloud provider. And when they do that, they enter into this mechanism of a complex key exchange mechanism where, however small, the threat remains that a cloud provider and a service provider like Meta could collude to decrypt some of that conversation. And we have worked hard to sort of close out that threat vector as well, recognizing ourselves as a potential adversary down the line, which means starting 2021, we've started offering encrypted backups as well, which means the user encrypts their chat history on their device, and the key stays only on their device or in some sort of a secured cloud that's accessible only to them. And this way we ensure that not just the conversations that people are having every day, but even the chat history that they save remains protected with end-to-end encryption. But I also recognize that discussions about encryption often get mired in the underlying technology. And it's useful to sort of step back and think about it in a real world context. Should people have the option to have a private conversation when they're not together in person? That is, I think, the fundamental sort of question around whether you support encryption or don't support encryption. For thousands of years, people have had the opportunity to meet and talk in person privately without an automatic system or a faceless government or someone else being able to learn what they're talking about and keep a backup of what was discussed between them. When people are meeting each other face to face, they naturally assume that the conversation is private. And this privacy has been crucial for personal relationships. It's been crucial for democracies. It's been crucial for human rights. Now, when we apply it to the digital context, when say you're texting a family member and you're discussing a sensitive health issue, should that not remain private as if you were whispering to them in the living room? When a journalist is communicating with a source about a breaking story, should that conversation not be afforded the same security as meeting in person in a secluded park? We think it does. And end-to-end encryption ensures that these digital conversations sort of remain exactly as private as their real-world counterparts. Encryption, therefore, provides the ability for people to speak honestly and intimately. It allows people the freedom to experiment with new ideas. It allows professional confidentiality. So conversations between doctors and patients or lawyers and their clients are all things that are protected by end-to-end encryption, and all sorts of personal information and sensitive data that people use these encrypted mechanisms to transmit also are protected. Now, there are a lot of misconceptions about encryption. The governments, and we'll probably talk about this more in the following hour, governments try to adopt a narrow view of encryption. Fine, you encrypt your communications, but why don't you just help us learn about the communication before it's encrypted, maybe on the user's device or so on. And this is sort of like how we've seen the conversation evolve. And we're opposed to it. And we believe that an expanded version of encryption and the promise that I talked about earlier, that no one should understand or infer what you're talking about, extends to this. It extends to encryption. It extends to protection of communications before they're encrypted and after they're delivered. So today, when our digital communications are so ubiquitous, encryption is not just a technical feature. It's a fundamental right, and that helps ensure a right to privacy, same as people have had for thousands of years in face-to-face communications, and we're committed to protecting that. I'll stop there, but happy to go into any of this in detail later on.
Thank you so much for that tour de force of encryption practical use. I love it. I think people don't think about it enough, and often downplay the value of that they probably feel themselves for privacy of their conversations. And to that point, Shane, um, we, as long as I can remember, the argument from law enforcement has been to technology companies just create a backdoor. So a backdoor meaning a way that law enforcement or government more broadly can get into communications without the user being aware that they are somehow present in that communications transaction. And by the way, Ben, I love that you refer to it as a promise rather than a lock. Lock is my lawyer thinking. You're clearly a software guy. You make it something prosaic and beautiful. Thank you for that.
Also a lawyer.
Yeah. Oh, very. Oh, well, then you're a better one than me for sure. You kept your artsy side. That's great. Shane, so what is the I'll just call you. You just wrote a piece that was published. Remind us where that was published so people can go grab it. But also talk about this notion of backdoors. Can this work? Is this a workable solution generally? Is it workable today? And then feel free to throw in anything other uh, consumers should be thinking about, or that markets should be concerned with the approach that government has unfortunately taken for decades.
Sure. Thanks, Bartlett. So the piece is available at AEI Ideas, the American Enterprise Institute. It's also, we have something called Tech Policy Daily, and this ran on Tech Policy Daily on October 14th. Title of it was The Vital Importance of Encryption for Consumers, Lessons from Recent Events. The recent events being that the US telecom companies were hit by Chinese hackers that were in their system for a pretty long time. And they showed the real vital importance of robust encryptions from this act. So the backdoor for US law enforcement became a wide open gate for Foreign Intelligence Service going back to the Communication Assistance for Law Enforcement CALIA Act of 1994. So that's a little of where the challenge is you realize the telcos, we'll call them, the carriers, had the legal obligation to create the backdoor back in 94. This is back when things were in just network operation centers, NOCs, right? And that was pre-cloud. It was pre-phone in your hand every day. And what I try to really emphasize in this piece is this is not, you're like, well, I'm not a criminal. Why should I be concerned about this and care about encryption? And you have to realize that it's not just communications, but you've got on your phone or whatever device, you've got photos, financial information, personal messages, as we talk about the messaging, and that strong encryption helps protect all of that information that is on those devices, even though the messaging is also very important. Another key thing I talk about in the piece is that with the European Digital Markets Act and this idea of, this drives me crazy, Ursula von der Leyen saying, why we don't need all these things. We just need, they need to interconnect. So she wants WhatsApp, Signal, your text message, whatever it is on Android or Apple, and fill in the blank others, Facebook Messenger, to all be able to talk to each other openly. And that just, it breaks encryption. You can't have, and I love that your idea of a software is that is an artist. Love that. We'll take that. Is that they will, you can't interoperate these at a level that you are used to with your, actually you just can't. Like it's binary, it's one or the other. But the Europeans don't care. And through their recent law, they've just said, we'll figure it out, smart tech people. And as she very much said, maybe it was one of the others, said, it's the tech company's problems, not mine, but we want this interoperability. And it's just a lack of understanding of how the technology works and how important the technology is to our everyday lives as we walk around with all of this technology around us, but we're also protecting that information through encryption.
Yeah, not the first time we've heard the argument to nerd harder and turn over the problem to the tech industry. So I'll throw this open. This is a little bit off script, but I'll throw this open to everybody because I suspect you all have your point of view on this. But I'm going to pick up on the thread that you threw out there, Shane. Like, so what? So, law enforcement wants to be able to get into your messages. Listen, if there's encryption out there, bad guys are going to use it, right? They're going to encrypt their messages, so that we can't track fill in the blank bad guy. Back in the 90s, it was all about drug dealers. It was all about tracking down the Colombian cocaine cartels. And I heard that example over and over and over. These days, I suspect it's terrorism, or actually, I think we've even moved past that, and it's become more CSAM or child trafficking. So what if law enforcement can get into our devices and our communications in an attempt to track down these bad guys?
So there's
Open to anybody.
listening about this morning. It's the digital breadcrumbs that we have available now. The cops think they need encryption broken. There's just so much more out there. I mean, it's just, and I always ask this of my cop friends. I'm like, are y'all just lazy? I mean, like, can we work around this, please? And the idea that it's the backdoor that was created really, through and this goes back to, AT&T when they were the only carrier was had a tight, cozy relationship and obligation with the government. And that was the one way that you could, watch the transom of information flow going along. We have much more to look at these days for especially criminal activity. And the idea that it's only encryption that can solve their problem, it just doesn't fit.
Anyone else?
I can offer up. I mean, I 100% agree with what Shane mentioned. And I think people that talk about encryption and sort of safety, encryption versus safety in sort of like those dichotomous terms, I think at best it's an inadequate understanding of technology, and at worst it's sort of a willful ignorance of what can be done. We do a lot in terms of, and we can do a lot just on the basis of behavioral signals, in terms of non-content signals, to be able to prevent abuse on our platforms. And one of the sort of hallmarks of like bad actors trying to leverage these technologies is that you can't do it without leaving some sort of a trail, some sort of behavioral pattern. A regular person using a messaging app looks very different than someone who tries to automate it for spam or scam or some other like complicit bad activity. And we are able to look at those signals, build classifiers, and automate a lot of our enforcement. We ban millions of accounts every month trying to abuse our systems, and there is a lot that can be done even without access to content.
I would just say it is harder for law enforcement not to have access to content. It's harder to do a criminal investigation. It's also harder for law enforcement not to have access to our homes. I mean, you'll find a lot of criminals if you don't have to open a door to get into a house, if you're just allowed to go in and look for criminal activity. In a sense, law enforcement, when they say we want a back door, they want a result. They want to have, it's like saying if there are going to be drugs in the house, they have to be on the coffee table so that if law enforcement walks in, they can see it. That's what the anti-encryption proposals sound like to me.
I'll just add one other angle here, which is that in the old days, a lot of the crypto debates operated in a little bit of a geopolitical vacuum or isolation, where it was very much about what happens here in the States and with law enforcement. This is a global issue, and as Shane pointed out in a new piece, we have Chinese hackers routinely trying to get into our systems, and the Chinese Communist Party has, pioneered all new ways of industrial espionage and other things. And, they surveil their citizens actively and widely. We don't want to go down that route. And we as a nation, having strong cryptography is a way to stop that, both for our own domestic concerns, but also our geopolitical concerns. Moreover, there's another side to that, which is that if we were to hobble our cryptography systems or our more powerful computational systems, that puts us at a disadvantage just more generally relative to the world and those who would actually take a stronger approach. So, we want to make sure we're on the cutting edge, that we have state-of-the-art systems in every way, especially as it pertains to our security and privacy.
Perfect, you guys. It's like it is like I planned for that question. Fantastic. Thank you for those different perspectives. Tom, would love to hear your perspective from someone who certainly understands the issue, but is a little more distant from it, as is probably a bunch of folks in our audience, and any response you have to the panel in general.
Bartlett, the word distant is very kind there, but I appreciate it. Yeah, no, several thoughts. The first thing is, Greg's point about, I think at the popular level, this idea that it's always wrong to make the job of law enforcement harder. And I think that the constitutional response to that is that due process makes law enforcement's job harder. You know what I mean? The Fourth Amendment makes law enforcement's job harder. There's any number of our most precious, inalienable rights that make the job of law enforcement harder. So it may be counterintuitive for folks, but the argument that, well, this makes the job of law enforcement harder uh, is an irrelevant argument. It doesn't make any sense, and so we don't want to fall victim to that. And that sort of segues into another thought that I had, and that is that, you know, as Tom Sowell says, there are no solutions, there are only trade-offs, right? And I think encryption is a great example of that. Yes, encryption can be used to evade the law. Yes, encryption can be used for nefarious purposes, but it's also by and large used for enormous benefit. And so there's always going to be those trade-offs. So what would be the trade-off for outlawing encryption? You know, you would lose all of that tremendous benefit as well. And at the very beginning, both Bartlett and Adam talked about sort of the 90s and sort of the history of this, but you know, unless my recollection is wrong, I think you both kind of just glancingly touched on something that I think we should drill down on a little bit more. And that is that we almost didn't get to use encryption, or we almost had, you know, encryption key escrow imposed on us, and you know, various forms of backdoors. And there was no assurance that we were going to win that. And so in the policy world, we talk about opportunity cost, right? We talk about how, like, when you regulate something, you don't know what you are ruling out. And it strikes me that we have a real world opportunity to look around us, look at the digital economy, look at the ability to make secure purchases online, to hold secure conversations, to sign contracts digitally and all that sort of stuff. That would have been the opportunity cost of not allowing encryption. If we had not won the encryption wars, we could look around us and see what the opportunity cost would have been. And so I think that's applicable to any number of policy discussions where we're talking about government regulation. You don't know what you're eliminating. You don't know what future opportunities you are sidelining because of those kind of regulations. So we should, you know, this eliminates the precautionary principle, right? This goes right to permissionless innovation, and I think that's really, really important. And I think it's important, and I'm glad that Greg brought this up. It's important that we acknowledge, you know, that there are inconveniences that encryption introduces, again, particularly for law enforcement. I mean, this is going back to my point about the 90s, is the Justice Department very much did not want encryption to be popularly available. The FBI did not want encryption to be popularly available. Interpol did not want encryption to be popularly available. And again, we can look around and we can see what the opportunity cost for that would have been. Bart, it looks to me like we may have time for some questions. So I'm just going to do the housekeeping thing and say, if anybody in our audience has a question that they would like to ask or a point they would like to make, please use the chat function. On that bottom menu across your Zoom window says chat, and you can type in a question there. And if there are any questions, I'd be more than content to just listen to the panel continue to discuss some of these issues. But if there are any questions, this would be a great time for you to go in. You know, I think I said chat and I was wrong. You should go into the Q&A and type in your question there. And if there are questions, we will try to get to them. Thanks.
And while people are thinking about that, so one example that didn't come up, but that fascinates me by the one-sidedness of the thinking, is around child safety. And so you often hear this example of, well, children, you know, there's an issue of, I'll just stipulate for the purpose of this conversation, there's an issue around child safety and child grooming and child abduction and trafficking. And how will we ever know about those communications if those children can have access to encrypted communications? I find it fascinating that we don't think about the flip side. If everything that someone under 18 is doing online is open for public view or has an easy backdoor, then of course the bad guys will be the ones who hack into that communications. And suddenly they know all kinds of personal and intimate details about these teenagers sharing their thoughts just visiting online. It strikes me as that's a much more dangerous situation than the reverse, which is where they get to keep those conversations private. But you never hear that case. I mean, we make that case, but the other side never makes that case. It's always, oh my goodness, this kid will be immediately kidnapped and shipped off to parts unknown, and sold into sex trafficking. So kind of to everyone's points, I do think there's this very much this populist mentality that overtakes in this area around security, I guess, for lack of a better word, although I hate perverting that word. And then the other thing I want to get out there before we go to questions, I had asked the panelists ahead of time. Hopefully, you all thought about this, but IPI has a long history and proud history of trying to put very practical results of policy into people's hands. And so, if you could name one thing that people should take away from this conversation, or one reason they should care about Global Encryption Day, encryption in general. So they go home tonight because this is what's going to happen. They're all going to sit around the family table and they're going to say, man, I heard the coolest conversation today. And here's the one thing that you guys should think about around encryption. What would that one thing be? And because I like putting Adam on the spot, I'll start with Adam and then I'll work my way around the screen. Adam?
Well, I would say it would be the idea that sweeping technological control regimes are never the right place to start policy conversations. More limited, incremental, targeted government approaches always make far more sense for both normative and practical reasons. The focus in general of technology policy, especially when it comes to something like encryption, should be on identifying concrete, identifiable harms instead of sort of hypotheticals or, boogeyman scenarios that government says necessitate completely open-ended and radical regulatory sort of preemptive prohibitions by default. Again, information control regimes. That's not where we should start a debate. We should instead narrowly focus. And I come back to this in almost every technology policy debate I cover, but it's particularly important here for the reasons that you identified, Bartlett, because people throw around terms like safety and security just so casually and don't think about unintended consequences at all, or the trade-offs that Tom identified, because they're all over the place. And you could very much undermine safety and security in the aggregate by trying to justify these sweeping information control regimes and massive government interventions that undermine our privacy and security in other ways. So I think that's why it's crucial to understand the value of trade-offs in this debate.
Beta?
Thank you. At the beginning, I talked about how we build privacy into technologies to almost be invisibilized, to something that like runs in the back end to protect users, that users don't necessarily have to think about. Often, like some of these regulatory interventions that we've been talking about also take on that veneer. Anti-encryption laws we've seen have come in many different forms, many different flavors. We talked about sometimes they take on the form of child safety regulation. Sometimes we see it take on the form of antitrust regulation. Other times we can see it in India and elsewhere. There have been traceability discussions. Don't decrypt everyone's conversation. Just tell us who was the first person that shared this piece of content that we're giving you. What I want people to take away is that, it can come in many different forms, but ultimately the goal of it is the same: to create a system in which, we start collecting information, start putting in some sort of a backdoor just in case this conversation or this mechanism is used by bad actors somewhere down the line. And you can't create a backdoor just for a particular harm, just for a particular type of bad actor. When you create a backdoor, that can be used for every other type of harm and every other adversarial actor to compromise everyone's conversation. So that's important to keep in mind.
Shane, what should people be talking about at dinner tonight from this? Because they will, and they're going to quote you. So think
They're looking
carefully.
for their talking points right now because everybody goes home and needs talking points for the dinner table. I'd say in a digital world, your data is only secure as the encryption that protects them. So digital encryption isn't a feature, it's a necessity.
Oh, look at that. How crisp. Thank you. All right, Greg, these are high bars for you to clear here. So, how is your talking point going to win the dinner table? You go.
I'd go around the dinner table and ask people what they did online and whether they think it was encrypted, the action that they took. And most of them are going to say, I don't know. And for most of them, their purchase at Amazon, their connection with their doctor, it's all going to be over an encrypted channel. And I'm going to know it. And so, what I'd want to impress the people around the dinner table is you count on encryption. You wouldn't be doing all the things you do on the internet without encryption. You wouldn't be sending a note to your parents about something really embarrassing if you didn't know that all the kids in school couldn't get it because it was encrypted. It has to be encrypted. Otherwise, we're not going to be able to have the society that we have. Listen, we did have about 50, maybe 60 events today for Global Encryption Day.
Wow.
They're all up on the Global Encryption Coalition website. I don't know if I can get it into the chat, if I can communicate with all the participants, but I put it into our chat for the panelists. It's if you go to www.globalencryption.org, you'll see all these events. One of them specifically focused on how kids use encryption.
Oh, wow. That's great. And I suspect there are plenty of parents who are not, to your point, particularly aware of that, and now they will be. So thank you for that. By the way, just as an aside, this video will stay up on IPI's website for some time. So this is something people can go back to and we'll be able to point to in the future. All right, Tom, how are we doing? Well, first of all, does that chat go out to everybody or is that just for us here, that link?
It says the host and the panelists.
Okay,
Well, yes, but I can also put it in the common chat as well, so I can make that available for everybody.
great. And then do we have any questions?
We strangely enough do not have any questions. And again, during my introduction, I was talking about how this is pretty much a nerd topic. I think a lot of people just came to learn rather than argue, and that's good.
That's perfect.
That's really, really good. If I may seize the prerogative really quick, since my microphone is unmuted. I think something that Adam said early on when he was trying to apply the lessons of the encryption wars to some of the current debates today, and he started talking about social media, and for just a second I was puzzled, like, where's he going with this? But it really struck me because what we have seen in testifying in various states and in writing and all this sort of stuff, the forces today that are out to regulate content moderation, the forces that are out there trying to regulate AI. What I have found, and what I think a lot of us have found, is that if you make a solid technological argument, it gets blown off. If you make a constitutional argument, it gets blown off. If you make a practical argument, it gets blown off. Anything that stands between them and their desire to regulate gets blown off. And so in that context, I can easily see companies saying to state legislators, if you pass this law and if you force this level of disclosure, we will have to stop using encryption. And that they would immediately say, that's fine. That's fine with them. That's fine with them. So I think it is very important for us to emphasize the importance of encryption and the fact that, encryption can be, as Greg said, a child protection strategy. It's not just another vulnerability that technology has introduced into society. It's actually a very, very useful tool for personal privacy protection, for e-commerce, and even for child safety. And so, Greg, I think we ought to make a lot more of that point of how encryption can be used for child safety, because that is where the fight is right now. And if we don't make that point, we will have states try to limit the availability of encryption if it gets in the way of their goal to try to regulate social media.
It's a great, a great point, and kind of underscores how this topic rides on top of or underneath so many other technology topics. To Greg's point, exactly, we've built so much of our expected world in the way we act and interact online is built on top of encryption and kind of, I guess, I'm putting words in your mouth, Greg, but taken for granted, or not really considered at all. But to your point, we're not likely to cough up our credit card, our social security number, our medical records, if we didn't assume that nobody could get into those as we're sending them to our doctor, to Amazon, etc. Okay, with double check, still no questions, right, Tom?
Yeah, that's right. So why don't
Okay.
we just sort of give everybody a chance to make a closing statement?
That's what I was gonna say. If you guys want to give a minute or two of whatever you'd like to say, and then please let everyone know how to either contact you or get more information about what you're doing on encryption. Feel free to make that pitch here as well. And Tom, the other thing, if you saw, there were a couple more items added in chat, Shane's paper, etc., to put in the broader chat. So let's see. Let's just go in the same order that we kicked things off. Actually, let's be crazy. Let's go in reverse order. So we'll start with Shane and then work backwards. So Shane, final thoughts, and how do we find out more about you and your writing?
So I would just remind people this is not a technical discussion at the end of the day. It is about fundamental balancing privacy and security. We didn't bring up human rights. It's very important to think about, your civil rights and your human rights. A lot of people found out during COVID that they didn't have the ability to talk openly, which they needed with their colleagues. Domestic violence was a problem. And a lot of women around the world are only handed a phone by a male part of their family, and they want all access to all the information they had. And there were just situations that they needed to be protected, and that the WhatsApp and other messaging things like that platforms were very important. And it just really highlighted they're still very important. So we need to remember the civil rights and the civil elements of humanity with these as well.
Thank you very much. And Betta?
That's a great point. Let me just pick up where Shane left off. I think we talk a lot about end-to-end encryption, but I think end-to-end encryption is probably one layer of protection that people have. There are many other insecurities that people have just from their devices being compromised to by law enforcement to devices being compromised by someone else, like in their household and so on. So privacy has a lot of different dimensions. End-to-end encryption is just one. And so we offer a lot of different granular protections across our apps to help people stay private. Even in cases where they might share devices with a household member, there are options for having multiple accounts. There are options for having locked chats that can be hidden away with a passcode, so that even if your phone falls into wrong hands, your conversations can still remain private. And that is something that I would love for more people to sort of like go in and look for, that there are all of these other granular settings that help you stay private, even in cases where your device is compromised, and these options are available and people should seek them out. They're probably too cumbersome to make available to everyone by default, but we shouldn't just sit on our laurels because we have end-to-end encryption enabled. There is a lot that we can all do to protect our own privacy as well.
Great point. Greg?
In a way, this is a debate about security versus security, as opposed to security versus privacy. There's the security that you get if law enforcement has an easier time doing investigations, but there's the security that you get from knowing that you can send a communication that others can't read. That is a very valuable piece of security. And I think we have to appreciate it more and how much we use it.
Thank you for that. And how do we get more information about, you've got multiple things about CDT, global encryption. Actually, you gave that link, but remind us how to
So
find out more about CDT, et cetera.
to get to our website, it's www.cdt.org.
Good deal. And I assume everyone knows how to get to Meta's website or Facebook or any of the other valuable tools and whatnot. Pick up your phone. You likely have the apps downloaded. And Adam, bring us home. Your final thoughts, and then how do we find more about you and what your organization's doing?
Well, people can find out more about me at the R Street Institute website, or they can just find me on Twitter. which I will always call Twitter and not X. Thank you very much.
Bless you.
So, 40 years ago, a political scientist by the name of Ethel de Solapool released a book that had an enormous influence on my life called Technologies of Freedom. And in Technologies of Freedom, Poole laid out a series of guidelines for freedom in the new digital technology age. He talked about the importance of allowing anybody to publish at will, how enforcement needed to be after the fact, not by prior restraint, how regulation was always the last recourse, not the first, and that in a free society, he said, quote, the burden of proof is for the least possible regulation of communications. And he said the reason he was bullish on the future is that the, quote, easy access, low cost, and distributed intelligence of modern means of communications are our primary reason for hope going forward. Well, he got it right, but the thing that really made this happen was encryption. It operationalized or created the foundations for our digital freedoms. We wouldn't have any of these other debates about freedom of speech or freedom of commerce, freedom to innovation, freedom to code, freedom to without secure communications and systems that made it sure that we were all confident in the kind of things we did on a day-to-day basis online. So I just want to say that that vision of technologies of freedom is still alive and well, thanks to encryption.
That's awesome. I just want to say on my behalf, at the very least, thanks to each of you. I have so enjoyed chatting with some of you who I don't get to chat with that often and putting this panel together for IPI. Thank you, Tom, for having us do it. And with that, I'll turn it back to Tom and for IPI.
Yeah, thank you, Bartlett. Thank you for putting this program together and for being the circus master for the conversation. I appreciate that. And for our audience, I hope you all learned something. I did, so that's it. I at least got some benefit out of this. And again, to go back to what I said at the beginning, I do think this is sort of part of the job of a policy organization is to be able to take complicated subjects and sort of communicate them to people who are interested so that they know what they need to know and they know what they need to do. And I feel like our panelists certainly did that for us today. So I very much appreciate them. And again, this video will be available on our website and on our YouTube channel. So it will be persistent content that you can access in the future and that you can share with friends. With that, I'll give a final thanks to Bartlett and to the panel. Thank you, everyone. Very much appreciated. Thank you for carving out an hour or so of your time for us today. And I wish our audience a good rest of their day. Thank you very much.